On behalf of the Chautauqua Women's Club, welcome to the 7th Contemporary Issues Forum of the 2017 Chautauqua season. I am Elizabeth Sullivan, the president of the Chautauqua Women's Club. The Women's Club has an impressive 128-year history of service to the Chautauqua experience, and today we really focus primarily on three things. We provide a venue where there are opportunities for dialogue and to form friendships. We provide scholarship opportunities for schools in the Chautauqua students in the Chautauqua Schools of Fine and Performing Arts. And three, we provide relevant programs. Every week we have 3 programs down at the house and then one on Saturday afternoon up here. I'd like to ask you to please look at our website to learn more about our programs and events. It's really easy to remember, www.chautauquawomensclub.org. No spaces. I just want to highlight 4 things that are coming up this week. One is the Chautauqua Professional Women's Network is hosting Barbara Beck on Tuesday morning at 9:15 at the clubhouse. Barbara Beck is the special reports editor at the Economist magazine, and she's going to talk about 50 years at the Economist. On Wednesday at 3:30 at the clubhouse, and I'm going to butcher this name, I'm afraid, Arzu Gayboula, an Azerbaijani journalist and columnist, will be our contemporary issues dialogue speaker. Arzu Gayboula is the morning lecture at the amphitheater, and it's entitled Digital Media in Authoritarian States, The Case of Azerbaijan. And I'm sure we'll talk about that and other things during the afternoon dialogue. On Thursday morning at 9:15, Meg Pickard, the Director of Recreation at Chautauqua Institution, will lead our Chautauqua Speaks series, talking about the real parks and recreation at the clubhouse. And next Saturday, at this same time and place, we will welcome Dr. Peter Strick, who is the Thomas Dietrich Endowed Chair in Neuroscience at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Strick is our Barbara Vacker Lecture Series speaker for 2017, and he will be speaking on Your Brain in Action. Afterwards, you are invited to join us to continue the conversation at a special dinner event at the clubhouse, and it will be serving brain foods that supercharge your memory, your focus, and your mood. To buy tickets to this event, please go to www.chautauquawomensclub.org, then to events, and then to special events. I hope you'll stop at the table over here where several of our members are seated and learn more about the benefits of membership. It's really a bargain at $25. Okay, the format for today. Our speaker, Dr. Gloria Duffy, will talk for about 40 minutes. After her talk, you are invited to come to the 2 mics for questions and answers. Please remember that we are looking for thought-provoking questions, not for speechifying. The talk is being recorded, and it will be available Sunday around 11. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Gloria Duffy. Dr. Gloria Duffy is a political scientist, civic leader, and public policy practitioner. She heads the Commonwealth Club, the public affairs forum based in San Francisco, which shares many similarities in philosophy and activities with Chautauqua. In 40-plus years in public life, Gloria has founded a city commission and several nonprofit organizations, chaired the board of a scientific research foundation, been a trustee of 2 different colleges, served as the CEO of several nonprofits, served in the federal government and negotiated agreements with former Soviet countries for dismantlement of their nuclear arms, been the first president of a conservancy developing an urban central park, managed her family's real estate business, and acted as a mediator for local and international conflicts. So in her spare time, she came to see us. Among the issues Gloria has dealt with in her leadership roles have been conflicting priorities in domestic and international policy, conflicts between development and the environment, tension between narrow interests and the public good, conflicts between secrecy and public understanding, and challenging situations such as sexual assault complaints on campus, embezzlement, and elder financial abuse. So today, Gloria Duffy will speak about the ethical challenge of leadership. I think her experiences will do us well. Please join me in welcoming her to Chautauqua.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Bunch of lighthearted topics for today, huh? Hi, Chautauquans. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is my first visit as the head of the Commonwealth Club, a much newer public forum, only founded in 1903. I've heard of Chautauqua for years. It's taken great stewardship to maintain this gorgeous place, and where everything is organized for education and awareness. So congratulations to all you've accomplished to ensure that this unique institution continues for future generations. I'm in awe. So I have two very slight connections to Chautauqua. My family spent a couple of hundred years, actually, in Pennsylvania. They departed Pennsylvania in 1895 for the new frontier in California to grow citrus in Southern California instead of farm in Pennsylvania. But they left behind their oldest son, who was at Drew Theological Seminary, and who was ordained a Methodist minister in 1896. From 1924 to 28, my great-uncle Freeman Redinger was the pastor of what was then the Methodist Episcopal Church, now the First Methodist Church just down the road in Westfield. The second connection is I have a summer home in a remote area of Northern California. McLeod is what it's called. It's a former lumber mill company town built in the 1880s. When I was renovating our house 30 years ago, we removed a closet in one of the bedrooms, and out from behind the boards fluttered 2 tickets to a Chautauqua lecture from 1920 with the name of the then occupant of the house and his girlfriend, his date on them. So I asked around, and the old-timers in town told me that the traveling Chautauqua program used to set up its tent on the green just below my house. Even in that tiny remote town, the lumberjacks, mill workers, and railroaders benefited from the knowledge that the Chautauqua movement brought around the country. Now, let me turn to the topic for our discussion today: ethics and leadership. Questions about ethics are very prominent in our national conversation right now. We're debating issues around conflicts of interest for public officials, honesty to the public and media, alternative facts, whether leaking of classified information is sometimes justified, the trade-offs between the good for many and good for the few, as in healthcare reform. What's the right thing to do about immigration? These are all thorny issues that involve questions of values and priorities. And in fact, choices of ethics and values face leaders at every level, in every part of society, every day. In business, nonprofits, government, education, religious institutions, the arts, and elsewhere, leaders constantly confront questions of choosing the right thing to do and the right ways to do it. In today's environment, sometimes one gets the impression that our society's best values, mutual respect, collaboration, equity, reciprocity, are in some disfavor. They seem to be regarded sometimes as dispensable, fuzzy-headed, naive, too much trouble, and not able to produce effective outcomes. Quite to the contrary, in my own experience, making choices that represent a strong ethical stance is not just right. In the long run, approaches that are inclusive, based on values like empathy, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration, make good business, good policy, good strategy, and lead to the most successful outcomes. Over the last 40 years, I've been very fortunate to be called to serve in leadership roles in some very challenging situations, ranging from local civic issues to national and international problems. And in every case, I've found that the choices and approaches that represent our best values have been the most successful in solving the problems. I'm going to describe 6 extremely varied challenges with which I've been involved, how each one was addressed, and how following our best values enabled us to solve the problems. Let's talk first about the most dramatic problem that I've ever been involved in addressing, and that was the problem of so-called loose nukes in the former Soviet Union. In 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, nuclear weapons, which had previously belonged to the Soviet Union, controlled by the Soviet government, were dispersed in 4 countries, 3 of them new countries: Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, as well as those that remained in Russia. So what happened was like a game of musical chairs. When the music stopped, whatever was on the territory of the different Soviet republics was left exactly where it was when the Soviet Union dissolved. And in all countries except Russia, it was under the administration of brand new governments. That included thousands of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and their delivery systems, military personnel, bases that hosted nuclear weapons. And these countries, other than Russia, were barely organized as new states. It was not even clear who was in control of the government. They had no experience in safely holding or securing nuclear weapons. In addition to the danger of having 3 new nuclear countries in the world, there was a danger because security was lax at bases and facilities that terrorist groups could obtain nuclear weapons through blackmail, through incursions, through breaking into facilities. So it was a big danger. Traditionally, with the background of the Cold War, the US would have responded by building more nuclear weapons, building defensive systems for ourselves to combat this new threat in the early 90s. Perhaps we would have threatened sanctions if these several countries retained the nuclear weapons on their territories, or to retaliate against them if they sought to use them for influence or military purposes. Sound familiar? We might have seen a pattern similar to the threats and counter-threats that are now going on with North Korea. Instead, back in '91, something very different happened. Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, a very smart and perceptive man, visited Russia in the summer of 1991. He found then President Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in the Crimea in an attempted coup. Senator Nunn thought, with the Russian president out of control, who had the button? Who had the codes and the authorities controlling the Soviet Union's tens of thousands of nuclear weapons? Because the president, as in this country, controls that capability. What would happen, he wondered, and this was prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union, what would happen, he wondered, if the Soviet Union did go away, break up, and lost control of its nuclear weapons? So Sam Nunn returned to the US and he talked to some of his network of experts in the national security field about the problem. He stimulated some foundations, especially the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and some universities, Harvard and Stanford, to figure out ways we could address the problem before it in fact became a crisis. The scholars at Stanford and Harvard, supported by the Carnegie Corporation, came up with a new concept called cooperative threat reduction, or preventive defense, in which the US would directly assist these prospective new nuclear countries to dismantle their nuclear weapons, and in the case of all countries besides Russia, to become non-nuclear states. Nunn enlisted, he reached across the aisle to the Republicans. He enlisted his Senate colleague, Richard Lugar of Indiana. And the two introduced bipartisan legislation for what they called the Cooperative Threat Reduction Act. The legislation passed in December of 1991, creating what was then named the Nunn-Lugar program after the two sponsors. It allowed the US to spend $400 million a year from our defense budget on dismantling nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons in the former Soviet Union, and it assigned the task to the Defense Department. Instead of building weapons to counter a threat, the Defense Department was charged with reducing that threat and getting rid of it before we had to counter it. The idea was to prevent the new threat to the US and the other nations rather than just reacting to it. Using our funds to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons, directly engaging the countries involved, was a novel approach. It was very long-term thinking on the part of the sponsors. When the Clinton administration came into office in 92, or early 93, several of the thinkers that Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar had tapped to design this new approach joined the new administration, including Bill Perry as first deputy and then Secretary of Defense, and Ash Carter, our most recent Secretary of Defense, then as Assistant Secretary. They had sort of created the ideas of how to do this. I was brought into the Defense Department to work with them because of my expertise on nuclear weapons and arms control and experience in the former Soviet Union. My job was to coordinate the US agencies involved in the project and to negotiate with officials in the former Soviet Union to get them to countries to get them to agree to what we wanted to do. It was not easy. Nobody really knew how to do this at first. Yes, we had legislation, we had money, but how do we get them to do what we want them to do? These were other sovereign countries, and lecturing them wasn't going to get us there. We tried that in the very beginning of the program, issuing statements and so on that did nothing. The efforts that followed were intensive for several years. They required US agencies to cooperate. Inside agencies, there had to be cooperation. We had to work with other governments to figure out what needed to be dismantled, how to do it, and how to create the leaders of these new countries, how to convince them to take the actions we wanted to take, and then implement it and get it done. In the Pentagon, where I worked, it was counterintuitive to what DoD normally did, which was, again, build weapons, train troops, and fight adversaries. We often had to convince our own internal colleagues that it was a worthwhile and high priority effort, which, by the way, had been assigned to us by the Congress and approved by the President. There were also challenging domestic politics. We had opposition in Congress. Some Congress members wondered why we weren't spending those funds in their districts. They launched investigations by the General Accounting Office. There were 11 of them going on by the time I left DoD, all of which we survived. So we had to weave together the various agencies and interests in the US. It was also challenging in dealing with the new officials in the countries we were dealing with. The Ukrainian parliament passed legislation that they were keeping 1,700 nuclear weapons on their territory. In some countries, it was, again, unclear who was in charge. We'd be talking to the foreign ministry one day and the defense ministry another day and the president's office another day as they sort of wrestled for who controlled this area as well as other areas in government back then. There was a lot of suspicion of our intentions. We had to build trust with the countries. So we got extremely involved with the countries over there. I made over 40 trips to the region. Many other officials went as well. The largest number was to Ukraine, which was the toughest case. I even at one point went on television in Ukraine to explain to the Ukrainian public why their country would be worse off with nuclear weapons. It took several years, 50 agreements, a lot of funding, and addressing the issues that were important to them in each of the countries in order to get them to agree. In Ukraine, they were concerned about where the military servicemen would go once the nuclear bases were shut down, so we helped them build housing for them. In Belarus, they had a similar concern. How would they retrain their soldiers for other careers once the bases were shut down? So we helped with that. We helped them set up job training centers. In Kazakhstan, they were concerned because they have a nuclear test site there where the Soviet Union tested hundreds of nuclear weapons over the years. There was radiation at the site. There was even an unexploded nuclear weapon at the site. And there were various problems, health problems, tumors, cancers, due to all of the radiation from both above ground and underground testing of nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan. So we helped them address that. So sometimes it was the tangential issues that meant most to the countries we were involved in. Whatever it took, we were there to work with them. In the end, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan were convinced to become non-nuclear, and all the nuclear weapons were removed from their territories within just a couple of years. Russia undertook actions we requested, dismantling some weapons and providing better security to those left on their territory. Over time, we eliminated 2,650 Soviet nuclear missiles and bombers, 11,000 Soviet nuclear warheads. We destroyed 2 million artillery rounds in Russia with 5,400 metric tons of lethal chemicals, and we eliminated an anthrax biological weapons facility in Russia. So the threat to the US of 3 additional nuclear powers was prevented. And in the end, it was the approach that was taken throughout this process, bipartisan, seeing the situation on the ground by Senator Dunn, a bipartisan effort with his colleague, Republican colleague in the Senate, collaborative with the countries we were dealing with and within the US, among our agencies and within our agencies. And it was very preventative. It was a look ahead to a danger that was emerging while it wasn't immediate. This was the approach rather than a more reactive, partisan, or confrontational approach, and it led to great success. The second problem I'm going to discuss was related to this first one. So in the former Soviet Union, not only were there a lot of loose weapons, but the government had employed many thousands and thousands of scientists to create their nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. When the Soviet Union and its government and its budget and its scientific structure collapsed, hundreds of thousands of scientists with critical knowledge about how to make weapons of mass destruction were left with no employment. They were literally thrown out on a moment's notice to sweep the streets or whatever they could find to do. Physicists, chemists, biologists, etc. So this created an additional danger of proliferation. They could be lured to Iran, North Korea, or any other country that wanted to pay them, or terrorist groups to help them develop weapons of mass destruction. The billionaire George Soros tried to address this immediately when the Soviet Union broke up. He presented $500 essentially to every scientist in Russia, which was a considerable amount of money back in those days, but it wasn't a long-term solution. What would happen after the $500 ran out? George Brown, chairman of the House Science Committee, had a creative idea, and he sponsored legislation creating a new foundation, the Civilian Research and Development Foundation. The purpose of it was to pair weapons scientists in the former Soviet countries with their scientific colleagues in the United States and give grants to them for civilian research headed towards medical research, towards commercial products, towards any other scientific pursuit than developing weapons of mass destruction. We created, the Civilian R&D Foundation created peer-reviewed scientific research competitions. It was created as a foundation under the National Science Foundation. And it also helped to connect the significant scientific talent in the former Soviet Union that had been cut off from the West. Scientists weren't able to travel, publish papers, receive foreign journals, etc. It had been cut off by their government's restrictions. This was able to connect them back with their colleagues in the US and the rest of the international scientific community. This was initially funded from the Nunn-Lugar program, from the Defense Department, and matched by George Soros, the Civilian Research and Development Foundation. It still exists today. It's called CRDF Global. When I left the Defense Department, I was asked to join the board and then asked to chair the board, which I did for 10 years. We funded hundreds of research projects, joint research projects in the basic and applied sciences, from mathematics to volcanology, leading to the employment of thousands of former Soviet scientists in civilian research. CRDF drew companies, universities, national labs, and venture capitalists in the US into this effort, not only supporting the research, but supporting steps to commercialize or further develop some of the research findings. The Civilian R&D Foundation now works beyond the former Soviet Union with scientists in many countries, pairing them up with scientists in the US. And beyond weapons scientists, it supports collaborative scientific research more generally. One current project is a project on the linkages between cancer and HIV in South Africa. So due to efforts like this one, we did not see weapons scientists from the former Soviet Union dispersing around the globe to help other countries or terrorist groups develop nuclear weapons. And once again, it was an approach that was insightful, intensive, collaborative, and preventative, rather than reactive and confrontational, that produced results. Now I'm going to zoom down to a much more local level, to a sequence of events around where I live in California. San Jose, California. Do you know your way to San Jose? Yes, I do. Is the city in and around where I've lived for the past 30 years. I work in San Francisco, but I live in the South Bay. It's the 10th largest city in the country with 1 million residents. It used to be the hub of what's called the Valley of Heart's Delight, with canneries and commerce that served the surrounding orchards and farms. A small river, the Guadalupe River, winds through the center of town. Now it's the hub of Silicon Valley. The Valley of Heart's Delight has become Silicon Valley, with a busy downtown with corporate headquarters of companies like Cisco, eBay, Intel, and Adobe Systems, and a bustling international airport. My story involves San Jose's river and its airport. And it does tie in with some national programs and priorities. As aircraft grew in size and flights grew in frequency in the 1970s to many metropolitan airports in the US, problems of noise grew in adjacent residential areas. There were increasing complaints and lawsuits against airport cities, even the FAA, over noise pollution and effects near major airports. In 1979, Congress passed the Aviation Safety Act, containing a provision, Part 150, for noise abatement. This required the FAA to take actions to mitigate the noise from aircraft that affected neighborhoods surrounding airports nationwide. Their actions could range from soundproofing buildings and homes to acquiring the land in the flight path of airports through eminent domain and removing the buildings. In San Jose, the growth of the city, as tech was starting up and booming in the area, all around the airport, meant that the airport approach zone is very close to residential areas, and there were a lot of these noise problems. Under Part 150 of the Aviation Safety Act, the decision was made by the FAA to purchase the land in the approach zone and remove all the homes and small businesses. The process of removal began in the early 1980s. Now, at the same time, the Army Corps of Engineers and the San Jose Water District were ready to begin a flood control project on the Guadalupe River, which was periodically flooding downtown San Jose. And it also flowed out through this airport approach zone to San Francisco Bay. These two federal projects for airport noise abatement and flood control made a very unique resource, 250 acres, 1/3 the size of Central Park, with a river running through it, available in the middle of San Jose, a very industrial city, very developed city. The question was, what to do with what was, by the late 1980s, an extremely valuable piece of land. The then mayor of San Jose, named Tom McHenry, set up a task force to recommend to the city council what to do with this land that had previously been homes and businesses with the river running through it, and I was appointed to the task force. It was near my home, actually. We reviewed many proposals for the use of this very choice land, and many of them were private uses: golf courses, motocross racing, commercial flower growing. But as a metropolis that had spurted with the growth of Silicon Valley and was prone to urban sprawl, in San Jose there are few parks that are accessible to those who live within the city. So we recommended making it into a public park with diverse elements like bike and walking trails, ball fields, picnic areas, green swards, areas of drought-tolerant native grasses, a heritage rose garden, programs educating school kids about the ecology of the river, a historic orchard to educate on the agricultural past of the valley, a Rotary Club-funded play garden specifically designed for disabled kids, and an area commemorating the Olympic skating champions from our region, Peggy Fleming, Rudy Galindo, Christy Yamaguchi, and Brian Boitano, and other elements as well. It was a good and ethical choice, reflecting public needs and interests, and an appropriate public use of the public funds from the airport, the FAA, and the city that had been used to purchase the land. It all came from taxes. It invited engagement from the community, from rose gardeners to youth groups to the disabled community. So a master plan was drafted and development of some of the areas of the park were started. Then I left to serve in Washington in early 1993 and returned in 95. The park master plan had been approved by the city council, development had advanced, and the task force had been turned into a nonprofit organization, now called the Guadalupe River Conservancy. The city councilman in whose district it was located asked me to be the first president of what's now called the Conservancy. We spent the next couple of years building the board, building funding, building the organization, and building the park. Towards the end of my time as chair, a serious conflict arose with the flood control project along the river, and it threatened to derail the whole project. Even though a more environmentally friendly approach had been required of the Army Corps than is normal, they were not building a typical concrete channel, but a natural stream with some concrete diversion channels for floodwater when they came. There were environmental issues that had arisen regarding disruption of the riparian habitat, warming of the water, interference with spawning for salmon and steelhead. So a coalition of environmental groups threatened a lawsuit that would have brought the development of the park project to a screeching halt. I contacted the public interest law firm in San Francisco that was threatening the suit and helped get together the players, the water district, and the environmental group in a collaborative dispute resolution process. Once again, this was the right choice. They reached an agreement for $150 million to be spent on remediation of the streams and watersheds over the next 2 decades, and based on their settlement, the project moved ahead. Now, 18 years later, there are some other issues that have arisen, and I'm getting back involved in this with the other former leaders of the project to make sure the park is preserved and developed in accordance with the master plan. Sometimes you get involved in these things and it's a lifetime commitment, kind of like you all at preserving and enhancing Chautauqua. Once again, as in the more global cases I've mentioned, dedication by the city of San Jose to the public interest, collaboration, respect for differing views, and finding ways to bridge conflicts have been key to securing this important resource for one of the country's most rapidly growing cities. Other cities, these noise abatement programs took place all over the country. Other cities did not follow such a process. So, for example, 40 years after it was cleared, if you fly into Los Angeles International Airport, you will see the 430 acres sitting abandoned to the north and west of the airport that probably also could have been made into a nice park. Now I'm going to talk about the fourth problem, one of the thorniest we've been dealing with across the country over the past few years, and that's the issue of sexual assault on campus. I'm obviously very aware of this. At my alma mater, Columbia, the woman has been carrying around the mattress, which has become a dramatic symbol of this. As an undergraduate, I attended a private liberal arts college in Los Angeles called Occidental College. It was one of the first colleges to be deeply embroiled in the charges of sexual assault and the complaints that the institution was not handling them appropriately. The attorney, Gloria, who's based in LA, decided to make Occidental a test case on this issue. So in 2013, she represented a group of women students who sued the college over its handling of their cases. They also filed 2 complaints with the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education, alleging that the college had violated Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. The college made a settlement in the court case. This is a very complex issue, and as a trustee, I've reviewed many of the cases in great detail A few cases are out and out assault. A student climbs in another student's window and rapes her. Very clear. There was the case of the swimmer at Stanford, water polo player who brutally raped a woman. These cases have made national news. And it's imperative to protect women and other students on campus against these kinds of crimes, and they are crimes. But many, many cases are more murky. Many incidents are caused or exacerbated by alcohol or by behavioral norms of young people today, by mental health issues, by the use of drugs, and other factors. The parties involved often have different views or cannot remember what happened during the incident. At Occidental, the board and president were delivered a very difficult situation here. Lawsuit and federal complaints. And it's been replicated at probably more than 200 campuses across the country. At Occidental, we resisted reacting to the many attacks that were being leveled at the administration and the board by student and faculty activists about our handling of the issue. Instead, we focused on working with the president and the administration to improve and professionalize the practices to handle sexual misconduct. Especially small colleges have been unprepared for this. They're a little bit like mom and pop operations, where big universities have very elaborate structures to handle this. It's taken a lot of smaller colleges unprepared. We hired a Title IX coordinator. We hired a victim advocate. We professionalized the investigation process that had been more or less handled like an honor court prior to that. We listened to all sides. We specifically created a dialogue between women on the board and women on the faculty, because the women on the faculty had been advocates for the women students with the complaints. We instituted educational programs for students on appropriate and inappropriate sexual behavior, starting even before they arrived on campus, with online training. We brought speakers to the campus. We educated about the definition of consent and the need for parties to obtain positive consent prior to engaging in sexual activity. We coached students and staff on being active bystanders, intervening to stop sexual misconduct. We instituted better coordination with the Los Angeles police so that where criminal assault may have taken place, it was treated as such. We made sure alerts are disseminated all over the campus by text and other methods as soon as an incident had occurred, so students could protect themselves, and of course we upgraded campus security. We increased mental health services on campus, and we still have work to do in educating about the effects of alcohol on behavior. It took several years to sort the situation out. About a year ago, in 2016, after a 3-year investigation, Occidental was found not to have violated Title IX of the Civil Rights Act in its handling of cases on campus, and it was complemented by the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education, whose spokesperson said that they had found a campus actively engaged in important work to satisfy Title IX responsibilities for all students, Occidental leaders committed to taking appropriate steps to ensure students' safety, et cetera, et cetera. So we received not only an exoneration on the Title IX matters, but a compliment for the Office of Civil Rights. It's not always easy to retain balance, especially with heated arguments and high stress levels, such as those associated with this issue. But it was the right thing to do, listening, engaging all the constituents, educating, and really focusing on improving the process. Now I'm going to turn to another local issue, this one in San Francisco, and this one involving the Commonwealth Club. The Commonwealth Club is a nonprofit. Unlike having a gorgeous campus like this, we've been renting our space for 113 years at downtown San Francisco prices. So in the last recession, when our budget was stressed, we decided we needed a home of our own, just one building, to make our budget healthy and to sustain our existence as a public forum. we were able to locate and purchase a beautiful waterfront site looking out on San Francisco Bay. It had been rejected for development by the city of San Francisco previously due to a conflict between developers and unions. Our site had an important history for the labor movement, locally, nationally, and internationally. In 1934, it was the first headquarters of the Longshoremen's Union. It was the office for Harry Bridges, an Australian labor organizer who was a major force in organized labor in the US and around the Pacific Basin. In 1934, in the summer, there was a strike by the dock workers, organized from in our new location, in our site, by the Longshoremen's Union, by Harry Bridges. There was a clash between guardsmen sent out by the city of San Francisco and the strikers, and 2 of the strikers were killed. They were brought into our site, laid in state there, and that's where their funeral procession left from, that went through the streets of San Francisco, and there was a general strike in sympathy with all the other unions in San Francisco for the killing of the dock workers. Very big event in labor history, certainly locally and nationally, because the next year, in 1935, Congress passed the Labor Reform Act, which embodied several of the reforms that the strikers in San Francisco were demanding: collective bargaining rights, the right to union hiring halls. So that's the historical background of our piece of property on the San Francisco waterfront. About 10 years ago, the Heinz Corporation, a major developer, had tried to build a 10-story mixed commercial and residential building on the site. And it's a prime location. It looks right out on the water, on the Embarcadero. They approached the city of San Francisco for entitlements, and they claimed in their applications that nothing of significance had ever happened at the site. So they asked for a pass on the historic review and any historic mitigations or commemorations. Very big mistake. The unions, of course, didn't share this view. The Longshoremen's Union, of course, didn't. And in fact, they considered it an insult because the Longshoremen's Union considers that essentially ground zero for their organization and their establishment as a union, and also where this historic event happened involving the killing of 2 strikers. The unions pressured the San Francisco Board of Supervisors to reject the Heinz project, which they did. So the site had been sitting vacant for a number of years when we purchased it, and was in some circles considered to be possibly undevelopable. So immediately when we located the property and put a down payment on it, even before closing escrow, we approached the Longshoremen's Union. I talked to Willie Brown, the former mayor of San Francisco, who was friends with a key official in the Longshoremen's Union, got an introduction, and we talked with the union representatives, embraced them, and included them in our whole process for developing the site. They have the history, they have a historian, they have an archivist, they know what happened there. As the Commonwealth Club especially, we're delighted to educate about this instance, whether you're pro-union, anti-union, whatever. It's history, it's important history, it happened there, and it needs to be recognized. We had opposition to our project, not from the unions, but from a sort of a strange guy who lives on the waterfront and opposes any development there. We were taken to 2 planning commission hearings and a full meeting of the Board of Supervisors. But the unions spoke up, supported us all the way along, and they recruited the other union. The longshoremen recruited the other unions in town. So we had the Central Labor Council, we had the Building and Trades Union, and all the other major unions in support of our project, and they actually sent people to the hearings and spoke up for us. Wrote emails, wrote letters. So we had 3 unanimous votes. It took a while. San Francisco's a very populous city, so any one person can more or less stop a development project or hold it up while there are public hearings and scrutiny. Took us 9 months, but 3 unanimous votes. And the union support was a very important part of it. Reaching out, being inclusive, acknowledging the Union history were the right things to do, important events in American history, and it also ensured the success of our project. We're just finishing 2 years of construction. Our grand opening is on the 12th of September. There'll be a plaque on the outside of the building where the text was written by the union representatives with our collaboration, and there'll be educational material on a screen inside the building about this labor history. So rather than sitting empty, the site now educates about this important labor history from the US, in addition to providing a beautiful home for the Commonwealth Club. I'm going to end by mentioning another problem, which I've encountered personally, and which is what the Women's Club originally asked me to spend some time on, where all these other examples are situations where strong values, ethics, norms, reaching out, collaborating, have all produced very, very good outcomes. The last area I'm going to talk about is one in which strong enough norms have not been yet established by our society, and thus it is harder to pursue good and ethical outcomes. And this, again, it's a wide departure from the other topics I've discussed. The victimization of our elderly population in our society by scams, some institutions, sometimes family members, has reached epidemic proportions. People are living longer, so their funds have to stretch farther. So when elder financial abuse happens, it's a particularly dire problem. I know this from personal experience. I had two parents, and it happened to both of them. In 2004, my father committed suicide, which was disturbing enough. What then unfolded was also very distressing. A sleazy, bottom-feeding attorney had recently gotten to know my father in Palm Springs, where my father lived, and had influenced him to change his estate plans to make the lawyer his executor and his successor trustee. The lawyer had set up a supposed religious charity called the Good Shepherd Association, which, under California state law, exempting religious organizations from filing tax returns and being subject to government oversight, of which there was no method to find out what it actually did or what happened to funds held by it. My father hadn't been near a church for at least 40 years. The lawyer, you might have guessed, was the chair and the only board member of the charity. And of course, under the trust he wrote, he was allowed to pay himself fees to manage the charity. The lawyer had apparently tested his strategy the year before my father died, supposedly getting my father to sell a property he owned and supposedly pass through the funds to a church through this entity, the Good Shepherd Association. We were told by people from the church that the funds never received the church, and you guessed it, most of my father's estate was designated to go to the Good Shepherd Association. We filed a lawsuit down in Riverside County, which was difficult because it had to be done in the county where my father lived and the lawyer practiced. Being a lawyer in that county, he knew the ropes, and we were outsiders, all of which I'm sure was part of the plan from the beginning. We brought in attorneys from LA, and after much effort and cost, took a settlement and a not very genuine apology from the attorney. Sort of, whoops, he was sorry. We have no evidence about what happened to the remainder of the funds that supposedly went to the Good Shepherd Association, which has now been deregistered with the state of California. We have a pretty good idea that they didn't go to any charitable purposes. This experience heightened my awareness of the issue, as you might imagine. And several years later, my sister and I realized that my mom was in a similar situation. Her funds were being spent down by someone else. She was living in quite a mess at her home. She wasn't receiving proper medical attention. Despite a considerable income, she didn't think she had funds to go to the beauty salon. She was confused about where her money was going. She needed heart surgery, and again, was not getting the proper and timely medical attention. After trying unsuccessfully through my usual collaborative methods to remedy the situation by persuasion, my sister and I had to go to court again. We were successful after a protracted struggle and great expense in protecting my mom's life and her remaining assets. She got her heart surgery at Stanford at age 88. She now lives with me and my family and is thriving at age 93 with her funds used for around-the-clock care and her other needs. Elder financial abuse is an extremely prevalent problem in our society. There are more schemes and scams than you can imagine, and I imagine some of you have seen some of this. Families have to be watchful, and as individuals, we need to be active bystanders for those around us. We have a next-door neighbor in McLeod at our summer home who keeps telling us about the really nice hospice volunteer who visited his wife before she passed and now visits him frequently and stays overnight. Every time we've invited him to bring her along, like at our 4th of July barbecue this year, to our home, she has a migraine headache or for some reason can't come, which now makes me suspicious, and we're asking some friends in town to look into the situation. My mom's closest friend, age 91, recently told me about the request from her very nice neighbor to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars that she had realized from the sale of her home up in Mendocino on the coast. I told Geraldine, no, please talk to your daughter about this. Do not, under any circumstances, you're not at the age where you should be loaning that amount of money. You have to be watchful. You have to be a bit of a busybody. And when you find behavior that's abusive, you have to take action. If one looks closely, one may see danger signs. My younger sister had noticed the attorney lurking around my father, but assumed that was my father's wish. My mom had been complaining for years that she didn't have any money, which seemed very strange, but we ascribed it to her depression mentality. We should have listened more carefully and become more involved in each situation earlier than we did. There's a need for a better legal and social framework in our society to prevent and remediate elder financial abuse. Laws on the books aren't enforced always. Little awareness by banks and other financial institutions. There needs to be better oversight over the legal profession against self-dealing. What that attorney did in Palm Springs is supposed to be certainly unethical, if not illegal. Needs to be oversight of supposed religious charities, and better education of seniors and their families by nonprofits, churches, senior centers, and so on. It's a difficult issue, but we need to talk about it. In conclusion, looking back on these 6 issues, generally, the most ethical and collaborative approaches have been the most successful. Steering by the compass of these values, we have 3 less countries with nuclear weapons than might have them. We have thousands of weapons scientists who aren't helping terrorists or rogue states make weapons of mass destruction. We have a 250-acre park in the nation's 10th largest city. We have a college that was able to handle sexual misconduct in a way beneficial to the entire campus community. And we have a new home for the Commonwealth Club that already brought groups in the community together that aren't normally bedfellows in the development process, and it will continue to, of course, the club will continue to do this, which is its mission more generally. With concerted effort and good values, I'm sure that over time we'll be able to make progress on the elder financial abuse issue as well. So when you observe leaders indicating that berating, confrontation, demeaning others, denying the viewpoints and interests of others, and similar approaches are effective in solving the problems we face, don't believe it. Societies with strong ethical traditions, like the US, Great Britain, other European societies, Japan after World War II, Australia, Scandinavian countries, do much better economically and socially than those without such traditions. For example, Russia, Ukraine, some Latin American countries that have had the burden of poor ethics, conflict, and corruption. Those with stronger ethical structures do better at solving their problems. If the national government communicates that the way to behave is through confrontation and manipulation, then that kind of behavior could begin to pervade our society more generally. Mutual disrespect and mistrust in a society is a slippery slope down which lies an inability to solve our problems. Given the challenges we face, that's a slope we cannot afford to be on. Thank you. Now, questions are welcome about any of these wide array of topics. Yes, sir.
Yeah, two issues. If the administration, or if you were in a position to advise the administration on the North Korean situation, what steps would you take to try to resolve this issue? And second, the Obama administration put through a number of regulations nationally with universities that in effect limited the rights of the accused. And some of the accused have won lawsuits for false accusations, their ability to confront witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. So if you would address the other side of that issue too.
Very easy questions. Let me start with sexual assault. So my college and many others have now experienced what are called John Doe lawsuits. That is the accused, mostly males, suing for infringement of their rights to equal justice and so on. And some of them have a point. So that's why I and my colleagues at Occidental believed it's especially important to listen to all sides, to improve the process for everyone. There was a certain pressure to believe it was an issue in which only the victims were affected and that everyone with a claim was a victim. That is not true. Again, largely because of the alcohol, the drugs, the behavior, lack of memory, many other factors. So very important to create a process which treats both alleged victims and the accused fairly and equitably. And it's good policy too, because again, John Does are now suing and so on. So, and the Trump administration has announced an effort to move the pendulum back, which is not necessarily a good thing, to protect the accused more. But each institution should embark on equitable policies and a good process that can get to the bottom of what has happened and avoid the lawsuits that are now coming from the males accused. With regard to North Korea, I knew this would come up. Unfortunately, we're really far down the road with North Korea at this point. There was an effort back in the 90s to embark on a similar road with North Korea to that we got engaged with the former Soviet countries. There were actually some scientific exchanges going on with North Korea. There was more contact between North and South Korea. Family visits were being permitted. There were even I think it was in 2000, the North Korean and South Korean Olympic teams marched into the Olympic Games together. So a lot of lost opportunities back then. At this point, I don't think that threats help a lot. If I were there, I would be working very hard on China, because China has influence over North Korea where we really don't. All of those conduits of contact that grew up in the 90s and early 2000s pretty much don't exist now. So I would be pressuring and agitating China. China gives North Korea, well, they've now come in on the sanctions resolution, they give, in reality, they give North Korea a pass in many ways. There's all that commerce that goes on across the Yalu River. There's all the business and trade that North Korea is able to do to fund the current regime. And China controls a lot of that. There are workers that go back and forth from China to North Korea. So China needs to take a more severe stance with North Korea. But I don't think, threats to bring destruction such as the world has never seen is the right way to go about it.
And you don't see a lot we can do at this point?
Well, we can leverage China. That's the main thing we can do. We can protect ourselves and protect our allies. And we do have some missile defense systems in the area. We've been focusing on developing those, for South Korea and for the Pacific, around North Korea. That's missiles that can shoot down other missiles. So keep strong, keep those systems in place, keep protecting ourselves and agitate China to do something. There's very little we can do directly. Bottom line, by the way, the Kim Jong-un regime has to go. Nothing's going to change there as long as that family and that regime is in power. How to make that happen is another question, but regime change has to happen. This has not changed in 3 generations. Their approach has not changed in 3 generations. It's a terrible regime, and it has to go. Again, how to do that's a little more complicated. Yes, sir.
Hi. What I was wondering is, were there any programs to find alternative for Americans involved in the nuclear development? And currently, military and private civilians in like drone programs and stuff, finding alternatives for them?
Are you speaking about in the United States?
Yes.
Well, things are different in the United States. A weapons scientist has many alternatives in this country. In the Soviet Union, in the former Soviet countries, they were totally supported by the government, and there was not an active commercial economy. So they couldn't just move over to work for Dow Chemical or work for Chevron or work for whomever. The companies didn't exist. The job opportunities didn't exist. In this country, the job opportunities are great. Skills are transferable. Scientists at Lawrence Livermore can come over to work in the technology industry right across the bay. So there are very, very transferable skills. Therefore, there's never been a program really focusing on the United States for a transition. The transition is possible with everyone's individual actions.
I wasn't thinking so much of the scientists as the drone technicians.
Well, again, military people and scientists all can find civilian work and civilian careers if they want to. In my part of the country, jobs are searching for people to fill them in the general technology area. So I think the alternatives exist here in the United States. Yes, sir.
A very famous Russian mathematician invited me and several other people to make one of those CRDF proposals.
Great.
Well,
Thank you.
This was some years ago, and we did, and it was. I sort of thought that it was for weapons scientists, but we were in abstract algebra, and our proposal went nowhere.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, that's all right. But I was just wondering. I looked through the material, and it didn't say specifically that it was just for weapons scientists. So
yes,
you did mention that there was some mathematics actually awarded. So I had 2 questions. One, was it just for really just for weapons scientists, and what? You probably can't remember this, but if I would be really interested if you could remember what the mathematicians were doing that were actually weapons scientists.
Of course. So if you want, on the website, CRDF Global, you can find lists of all the projects that have been funded and so on. So it's been in existence now for almost 25 years. So there's been a lot of evolution in the program. At first, the scientists were required to show that they had been involved in a weapons program somehow, somewhere, or at the very beginning. Then it evolved gradually away from that because over time, the weapons programs had diminished in the former Soviet Union. So over time, there were less scientists with recent pasts in the weapons area. So it did evolve over time, but you can find all the proposals and a description of the changing evolution of the work on the website. Thank you. So this is the Women's Club. Ladies, questions? Ladies. maybe before then. Okay, yes, sir.
First, thank you very much for your presentation. This is my first day here, although I grew up near Rochester and so forth. The first word I learned in San Francisco, where I went to study the Russians in '62, was xenophobia. I was in Moscow in 1997 when NATO was put into Poland, and I thought, what are we doing? If you look at their history, Napoleon, World War I, World War II, threats from the West, they've had a history of it, and I'm curious. And the first question, that was from, I didn't even know Russ was here. He's a Vietnam combat veteran. I'm a Vietnam era vet. I was a medic in this country. I'm very lucky to be alive.
Sure.
I thought Vietnam was a mistake in 1963 in boot camp, 10 years before we got out. Anyway, thank you very much. So to supplement his question, where's the reciprocity with arms reduction? The Russians reduced theirs, I believe. I know they're the ones that still have them in the other 3 countries. Thank you so much for your elaboration on that.
Sure.
But the key word is reciprocity. We all should get rid of this stuff, And finally, the NATO question. What do you think about putting NATO in Poland in 1997?
Sure. Okay, so reciprocity, again, things have evolved over time. At the time that we were working with the former Soviet countries, we were also reducing our nuclear weapons. The end of the Cold War, less need for it. We were actually targeting our remaining nuclear weapons out to sea by agreement with the Russians. They were doing that as well. So it took some time to retarget them in a case of a crisis. Couldn't be a hair trigger response or anything. There was a lot going on here, as well as in the former Soviet Union. But we had a change of political philosophy and things, we had 9/11, most importantly. So our sense of beleaguerment in the world grew. We restarted some of our nuclear weapons programs to modernize our warheads and so on. So we too have reduced somewhat, but there was a bit of a turnabout that occurred in 9/11 and the years afterwards. And that continuing development of our nuclear weapons continues to today. In fact, this is one of the ironies of these things. We have something in force now called the New START Treaty, which limits the numbers of nuclear weapons for the US and Russia. In order to get the New START Treaty through the US Senate, it had to be ratified by the Senate. President Obama had to promise funds for further development of our nuclear arsenal. It was one of those trade-offs, political trade-offs that occurred. So we actually have programs underway modernizing our nuclear weapons under that funding. So again, things were going in one direction and then they took a bit of a turn. NATO. So again, things have changed over time. When the idea originally was that, back in the early 90s, was that Russia would be a member of NATO. That was the idea. The US formed something called the Partnership for Peace, which was sort of like a stepping stone to NATO. And it involved Russia and it involved the Eastern European countries. And the idea was the Soviet Union was gone. The US and Russia were on a pretty collaborative course. So NATO would then turn into an alliance not against Russia, but against terrorist threats, other rogue states that might develop nuclear weapons, and other threats out there. So the original plan was that Russia would be a member of NATO along with the US. So it was included in this kind of first step towards NATO called the Partnership for Peace. Then again, things took a turn. Putin came back, and we ended up moving forward with NATO membership for the Eastern European countries, not for Russia, which Russia by then was not particularly interested in. And so, the divide widened again until we are in a somewhat adversarial relationship with Russia again. Good ideas, good policies, but politics took a turn.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hey, Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask a question about sort of personal and political.
Sure.
In terms of your training, because you gave 6 examples of really quite different issues. And could you talk about your training and then perhaps the ability to involve women more in or to create opportunities for women to be more involved as you have been in this great work?
Thank you very much. And I realize they were diverse examples. I hope that all made sense. So, first of all, let me just say that in my field of national security and dealing with arms control and so on, from the time I was in graduate school until today, there's been a massive movement of women into leadership positions. Secretaries of State, a Secretary of the Air Force, our chief scientist in the Pentagon when I was there was a woman. Very, very distinct movement. One of my best friends is now the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, a woman named Rose Gottemuller, who was also the prime negotiator on the New START Treaty. So much advancement in that area. And how that happened, through mentorship and through good men who fostered women and so on. I guess ever since I was a kid, I was interested in many things. And I was aware, and I went to a great public school system in the community where I grew up. I had great family support from especially my grandmother and my mother, French lessons from the age I was 5, and they would hire teachers and, lots of after-school activities, music, all kinds of things. And I was aware of what was going on around me, so I became involved in things then that kind of led me into other things later. When I was in high school, in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s, friends and I noticed that there was a lot of kids without a lot to do and some drugs and things going on in our town. And so we had the idea of setting up a youth services commission for the little town I grew up in to organize activities and represent youth interests and so on. And so we got involved, and the mayor kind of coached us on how to do this, and the city council approved it, and it's still operating and doing a great job today. So I used some of the skills I learned there about drawing together the political environment in dealing with the city of San Francisco and the unions and other things that I've dealt with. So you start things when you're young, and they come back later in different forms. Those skills and concerns that you may have learned and been aware of in childhood come back later on. And so I have been asked to take on some tough areas, and so we joke in my family, if there's a problem, call 911 Gloria, trying to solve some significant problems. So, and then of course I had academic training in my field and so on, but I think it starts in childhood.
Could you talk about what the academic training was?
Sure. Well, again, I had attended Occidental, a private liberal arts college. No insult to bigger universities, but a great place to learn and grow and receive a lot of individual attention. Arrived at Columbia, became interested in the nuclear arms race. I was very concerned, having grown up in the duck and cover drill era in the 50s and 60s, and learning that the US and the Soviet Union had a total of 50,000 nuclear weapons pointed at each other gave me some concern when I was taking courses in international affairs in college. So I decided to focus in that area. Already had great preparation as an undergrad at Occidental, which has had a very strong international affairs and training and focus in my field. And so arrived at Columbia very well prepared, had wonderful mentors there, was at the Harriman Institute, which is a very outstanding place that Averell Harriman endowed before he passed away to study then the Soviet Union, now the former Soviet Union. Was a research assistant for Zbigniew Brzezinski, who became Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. So I was sort of tapped into what he was doing as an advisor to a presidential candidate. Had another wonderful advisor, Marshall Schulman, who had been in and out of government as an advisor to President Truman and an advisor to President Carter on the Soviet Union. So, Columbia exposed me to the wider world of politics and Washington and so on. So just, great educational experiences and a great base. That's why I love to see what you do here with kids, having them attend programs and do things here. It all starts very young.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have to clear the space in 5 minutes, so maybe stop it if people are up there.
Okay, all right. Yes, sir.
Right. I wanted to follow up on my predecessor's question about sexual harassment. I applaud your answer, which was roughly, we should all figure out a way to be fair. So that's the easy part. So my question to you, followed by a short comment, who decides what's fair? How does that get decided? And I can tell you that at my own university, the people who decide that are the lawyers. And their interest is not in being fair. Their interest is in protecting the university against lawsuits. And if somebody gets hurt, the so-called accuser, well, that's just collateral damage. So how do you react to that?
Sure. Quis custodiet custodiae.
I understand.
So again, my intensive experience has been at one college, and we have not eliminated faculty members, administrators, and others from the process of evaluating complaints. So maybe that's easier to do in the small college environment. It's no longer the honor court model. There's some professional investigation that goes on and so on. But there's still involvement by others in the campus community. And there's guidelines and there's principles and, you set up the process as best as you can to be fair to everyone. There's complaints and responses to the responses. It still has that, there's the ability of both sides to present their positions. And I think in the best circumstances, that's still what's happening. There are lawyers around too, but.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I have a challenge for you.
Please.
I'm from the East Bay of California. We have a crisis in housing in California. We bring in clergy, we bring in teachers, we bring in other educated middle class. We cannot find housing for them. And this is generally true, certainly in Northern California. How would you address this? Who would you go to?
Sure.
How would you
First,
do
what
it?
town? What town are you from?
Walnut Creek.
I'm from Lafayette, right on the Walnut
next
Creek
door.
border.
It's where I do my grocery shopping.
Well, there you go. Me too, sometimes. We still have our family home at the top of Rancho View Drive, where my brother lives. So, in any case, very aware of the problem. So, I'm a fan of some very creative solutions that have been proposed but never pursued. We have spaces around the Bay Area. We have in the South Bay campuses for schools that are not being used. We have some large tracts of land in North San Jose. I actually think that municipalities, possibly schools, could develop housing for their teachers. Tech companies on their campuses could develop housing for their workers. So I think that there are some possible innovative solutions. They've been talked about for years. The development community will never do this. It just doesn't pay off. But there are some public land and corporate land that could be great sites for housing. Another option is something my husband is very involved in. By the way, did 3 combat tours in Vietnam, too. He chaired the Board of Supervisors in Santa Clara County for many years and is a transportation advocate, public transportation advocate. He's advocating transit co-located development. It's called TODS, T-O-D-S. That means building housing above transit stations where it can be built. You can essentially build a platform over the rail stations, can be BART, can be Caltrain, can be the high-speed rail system. You build a platform, and then you can build very tall buildings on top of that platform. And on the platform, kind of along the lines of the High Line or something, you can have parks, you can have other, amenities. But you build up and you create housing that is right above the transit station. And then people will organize themselves largely to live near transit, because the other problem we have in the Bay Area is an impossible traffic and commuting situation. So I think there are creative solutions. Who can do this? I'm not sure.
Talk to Jerry Brown.
Maybe, or maybe, a region-wide task force, something like the Bay Area Council, the Bay Area Economic Forum. Anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm being told that the building has to be cleared. I'm happy to continue talking over in the area over there. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't bore you too much, and thank you very much for your attention and your good thoughts.